I generally like to see who I'm speaking to. I want to say a little bit about myself. I wasn't actually born in Brixton. I was born in, I think, Middlesex Hospital in the north of London, but my parents moved to Brixton in 1955 when I was 5. And what I do know about my birth is that at the time, well, I learnt later, that at the time I was born, in 1950, there were 30,000 black people living in the United Kingdom, not in London, but the United Kingdom. When I went to school, there were very few black children. I define myself now politically as black, and please note this, and I was a vice chair of black sections in the Labour Party. Black was a political term which encompasses, I should say, those of African, Asian origin, and other people. And I had a colleague, a friend, a brother, who, as a Palestinian man, defined himself politically as black. And he was rightly considered to be equal in our group. And this is black sections of the Labour Party, back in the days when there were no black MPs, and where, just for the record, Paul Boateng, and not a man I admire very much, but he was nonetheless, went to be selected. He sought to be selected as the Labour Party representative in Hertfordshire, I think it was East, and was told by the secretary of the Labour Party that he couldn't be selected because the voters wouldn't vote for a black man. This is Labour Party, not the Tory Party. You can kind of understand that. Labour Party. And out of that came the struggle for black sections of the Labour Party. And I'm proud to say that for a couple of years I was vice chair of that movement. And when a vacancy became evident in London Borough of Lambeth, where I had grown up and where I had moved back to, I was persuaded to stand to be a councillor, which I did. And unfortunately, I was elected. And even more unfortunately, in the following period, the Labour members for Lambeth had stood up against Margaret Thatcher and had been surcharged and disqualified for not setting a budget. And so it rested on a number of us, actually 3 of us, to hold the Labour government, Labour in power for a few months. Then we had an election in 1986. All of my previous colleagues had been surcharged and disqualified, and I had been a local government officer. I thought, well, I think I can do this job. I would have preferred to do another job that I got paid for. But being a councillor, you don't get paid. I put myself forward, got selected, was the leader, and it would be fair to say that quite a lot of stuff was thrown at me. I'm mindful of not using coarse language. But Margaret Thatcher and Norman Tebbit, to my great honour, didn't like me. And had they done so, I would have been mortally offended. I was then outed as a lesbian. It had already been known. I'd worked at Spare Rib and been various other things I had done publicly, television and radio, etc. So I was already out, but they decided to out me. I chose not to mention that I was a lesbian. That's particularly relevant because the reason I didn't, because I actually, when you vote for somebody who's going to set the rates and make sure the housing, homes are fit for rent and the bins are collected, you don't really care about the sexuality of the person who's responsible for that. At least that was my view. I mean, I personally didn't care what the sexuality was of the, let's say, Margaret Thatcher. But, so I was outed, which was fine. You know, I was like what I said to them was, and your point is, you know, it's a known fact, as though I was going to be embarrassed. Look how far we have come, that now, and I find it deeply ironic that that LGBT people are allowed to be married. Oh, God help us. As a feminist, I have a certain critique about the institution of marriage, and please don't offer it to me. I've been fighting against it for a long time. I don't have a problem for heterosexual people who have a sense of equality between them. entering into this thing called marriage. But I also think that they ought to have the right to enter into civil partnerships as well, and it might need a groundswell to allow heterosexual people to have civil partnerships, which currently they are barred from. I have in my hand something that is actually dear to my heart. It's so dear to my heart, the thing is falling apart. This is a copy of the Equality Act, and I really want to talk to you about law. I'm a passionate socialist. I'm a Marxist. But law, the law of this land, has in the past and will in the future enable us to have some language between us. It's not law isn't the summation of my politics, but it is the lubricant of discourse. Back in 1965, Britain was amongst the first countries in the world to have a policy against racism. I personally have a problem with the word race. I can recognise a human race, but I'm not sure what the white race constitutes or what the black races constitute. Actually, these are categories which were defined by racists back in the 19th century. So I have a problem with the word race, but for the purposes of law, the word race has now been dropped from the category race. I know that might sound strange, but under the 1965 Act, and certainly in the 1976 and its amended Act in 2000, the category race consisted of colour, race, ethnic or national origin. Now, I know what a colour is, ish. If I ever saw a white person, all the white people I have ever seen who are not as white as they ought to be have been dead, and they tend to be quite grey. So they're not actually white. These categories were the way of grading people and applying what? Status? Yeah. So I have a problem with the word race, but I do recognise there are ethnic differences between peoples. No hierarchy, simply a matter of fact that a person who comes from or whose heritage is Welsh has the right to define and describe themselves as Welsh. And that might be in contradistinction to somebody who might also be Celtic, may or may not be Celtic, by the way, if you come from Wales, but if your culture is Welsh and you have pride in Welsh culture, Welsh language, then you should be treated no less favourably because you're Welsh. I mention Welsh because in 2006 there was a legal case, which thankfully was won, and I'm surprised that it even had to have been fought. Two women were speaking Welsh in a, where was it? It was a blasty place that sells gifts and trinkets when you're on holiday, that sort of place. They were speaking to each other in Welsh on the Isle of Wight. And the owner threw them out because they were speaking Welsh. They took a case under the Race Relations Act, the Amendment Act at that point, and they won. Well, of course they bleeding won. The category race includes ethnic or national origin. They were Welsh. And it has been so since 1965, when Britain first agreed the Race Relations Act. Most of us don't know what the law says, and that's a good example. This has been extended. The stuff on race, and I won't bore you with the complications of the stuff on gender, and particularly equal pay, but imagine trying to justify two people doing work of equal value, and you pay the woman less than you pay the man. I'm sorry to say it's still going on, despite the fact that since 1970 it's been unlawful, but it does happen. But what we have now in the Equality Act is bringing all the equality laws together. The first thing, and you must be aware of this, I want you to be aware, because it's something we could campaign about if we were minded to do so. Section 1, Part 1, Socio-Economic Inequalities. I'm not going to read it out because I can't imagine who wrote this. Actually, let me read the first bit because it's so unbelievably awful. The public sector duty regarding socio-economic inequalities. An authority to which this section applies must, when making decisions of a strategic nature about how to exercise its functions, have due regard to the desirability of exercising them in a way that is designed to reduce the inequalities of outcome which result from socio-economic disadvantage. In plain English, it means take into account class. That's what it means. What's the first thing the incoming government in 2010 did? Said they are not going to enforce it. So the one piece of legislation that would have recognised class as a category of potential inequality has been suspended. I think we should nonetheless. I think we should recognise and enact, because you can, the fact that the government has chosen not to enact it, it doesn't mean that in universities we shouldn't take into account class. Just as people did, GLC, the Greater London Council, back in the 1980s, agreed that it would recognise discrimination on grounds of sexuality as part of the policies of the Greater London Council. The fact that the law didn't require them to do it didn't mean that a body, a corporate body, couldn't decide to go beyond what the law says. So I do urge that we recognise class, and the reason I do is because I care passionately about equality. I don't believe that a person should be treated less favourably, which, by the way, is the definition of what discrimination, direct discrimination, means. It doesn't mean that simply they're treated differently. It's less favourably. Now we have law that firstly was built upon the work that was done against racism. It now extends to 8 protected characteristics. Disability is slightly different, and it's the only piece of the legislation that allows a body, that's an employer, a public body, anybody, to treat disabled people more favourably if that will ensure there will be an equal opportunity for that person to participate. So there may be things, there aren't many, but it is lawful to treat a disabled person more favourably if that means that they are able to be equal. It might mean, and it's why sometimes some people who have sensory impairment might, in applying for a job, be interviewed in a slightly different way to somebody who didn't have that disability or impairment. Gender, ethnicity, the word race, I have difficulty using it. Gender, ethnicity, disability, sexual orientation, religion and belief, age, another one where lots of discrimination still occurs. We've got age, it's not equal to the other protected characteristics. You can still, for example, the first one is that the law begins at the age of 18, so discrimination against children comes under another piece of legislation that even fewer people know about. Above 65, there are certain things that can happen, but age from 18 actually applies to the end of your days. What a mishmash. But nonetheless, we're one of the few countries in Europe that brings, other countries have, by the way. We owe the extension of our equality laws to Europe, but Britain had some of the first. Some countries, like Poland, have a legal requirement, for example, on sexuality. They don't enforce it, and neither have they been challenged to do so, or if they have, it's been discreetly. We are, in my view, all equal. That doesn't mean we are all the same. I like to think we're all different. I don't even think that it is the case that two twins who are identical to each other are the same. I think that each of them is distinct and separate, as we all are. I want to say something about religion and belief because I think a lot of people get confused about it. In this law, in this legislation, religion and belief is slightly privileged. And some faiths are privileged within the category of religion and belief. Belief, by the way, you really need to know this, includes your belief that there is no God. The law, actually it says it's a bit more sophisticated than that, but the principle is that if your beliefs include being an atheist, what's the other word? Agnostic, thank you. That is protected in law. But you can't use it if you were trying to become, a vicar in the Church of England. You can't use your being an atheist as a qualifying condition. Okay, that does make sense, doesn't it? It does to me anyway. But our beliefs, as long as, and they're written in such a way, and I can't remember the exact words, but I invite you to consider reading this act and even having access to it. They are written in such a way, the stuff on belief, that somebody who is a fascist would not be able to argue that their beliefs should be protected in law. The criteria for beliefs is actually quite rational and fair, except that it excludes fascists. But I personally don't have a problem with that. So we have law. It does not require us to view each of us, each of other people, as the same. We are not. But in UK law, we are all equal. It is a great pity, one of the first things, or the second thing, after agreeing not to enact Section 1 of the Act, the one thing that they have done, you probably realise I'm not a fan of the Conservative government. And this is a bit of a giveaway, really. One of the things they have done is not provide any training. I think it ought to be almost compulsory at university that anybody who goes through a university course should have at least a short presentation, even some marking of it, but knowledge of equality law, because it covers us all. All of us are both protected and need to know how we don't breach the law. And how can you do that if you don't know what the law says? So I'm absolutely convinced that we need to know what the law says so that we don't make the hideous mistakes of making it up as we go along, which too many people do, including, by the way, the BBC, who is required, the BBC as our public broadcaster, is required to know what the law says, and most of them don't know, and consequently breach the law.